Set an egg on a kitchen table, and it seems almost too ordinary to deserve a second thought. A thin shell, a small meal, a creature so familiar it has nearly disappeared into the background of human life. And yet the animal behind that egg became one of the most consequential companions our species ever made. Not because it was large, not because it was powerful, but because, quietly, it learned how to follow us into nearly every system we built. Agriculture, trade, ritual, empire, diet, even time itself. For a very long time, the origin story sounded settled enough. Chickens were assumed to be ancient in the broadest, vaguest way. Somewhere in Asia, perhaps many thousands of years ago, perhaps in India, perhaps in northern China, perhaps in several places at once, while junglefowl were domesticated, and the bird we know today slowly spread across the world. It was a useful story. Wide enough to absorb uncertainty, old enough to feel believable. But the more closely researchers looked, the less solid that story became. Bones once thought to prove extremely early chickens in distant regions began to look suspicious. Some had drifted into older soil layers long after burial. Some had been identified too confidently from fragmentary remains. Some dates, repeated for years, were attached more to hope than to secure evidence. Then genetics entered the argument with new force. Genome-scale studies pointed not toward a diffuse mystery with many equal centers, but toward a narrower homeland, the red junglefowl populations of mainland Southeast Asia, especially a subspecies associated with what is now Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and southern China. Later biomolecular work on ancient material, including eggshell evidence and ancient DNA, helped anchor that broader picture in the archaeological record. And with that, the chicken's origin stopped looking like a simple livestock story. Because the deeper truth was not merely that chickens came from a different place than many people thought. It was that they emerged from a different kind of relationship than we imagined. The wild ancestor of the chicken was not waiting in a village pen to be invented. It lived at the forest edge. It roosted in trees. It moved through a world of bamboo, scrub, insects, seeds, danger, and distance from people. If humans had wanted to capture that bird in large numbers by force alone, they would have faced a difficult, unstable partnership. The bird was not designed for barns. It belonged to another ecological rhythm. So what changed? Not the bird at first. The landscape. Across parts of Southeast Asia, the spread of cereal agriculture, especially dry rice and millet cultivation, created something wild junglefowl had never seen before: concentrated, predictable, calorie-rich feeding grounds laid out by human hands. Grain on the ground. Storage nearby. Openings cut into older habitats. Edges where forest and field touched. In other words, a magnet. This may be the hidden mechanism that rewrote the entire story. Chickens were not first drawn into human history because we mastered them. They may have approached because we accidentally built an irresistible world for them. Our fields called them down from the trees. That idea changes the emotional shape of domestication. Instead of a dramatic act of capture, it becomes a slow narrowing of distance. The birds come closer. They feed more often near settlements. People watch them, tolerate them, perhaps protect them, perhaps value them. Selection begins before anyone has a word for selection. Familiarity deepens. A wild pheasant of the forest edge becomes, generation by generation, a social animal of the human edge. At the archaeological site of Ban Non Wat in central Thailand, some of the earliest unambiguous domestic chicken remains date to roughly 1650 to 1250 BCE. That date matters not because it is simply older or younger than expected, but because it places the first secure evidence inside a very specific world, one shaped by farming communities, grain economies, and new ecological opportunities. Suddenly, the chicken's beginnings are no longer floating in mythic antiquity. They are historically situated. They belong to a landscape people were actively remaking. And once that threshold was crossed, the scale began to change. A chicken is a small animal, but a chicken that can live near people, forage efficiently, reproduce quickly, travel easily, and eventually provide both meat and eggs is not small in civilizational terms. It is portable wealth. It is ritual material. It is a timekeeping animal, a status marker, a gift, a sacrifice, a source of alarm calls at dawn, a sign that one ecological system has fused with another. This is where the story opens outward. Early chickens do not seem to have spread across the world immediately as food in the modern sense. In many places, they appear first as unusual creatures, even revered ones. Burials in Southeast Asia include partial or whole chicken skeletons placed with humans. In Iron Age Europe, some of the earliest chickens were buried intact, sometimes alone, sometimes with people, showing little sign of butchery. Males were associated with cockerels, females with hens. These were not just calories with feathers. They carried meaning. That delay is one of the most revealing details in the whole story. It tells us that the first great expansion of the chicken was cultural before it became fully economic. People did not simply meet this bird and think of dinner. They saw omen, display, ritual, novelty, perhaps prestige. A creature can enter a society through the imagination before it enters the kitchen. And then trade took over. From mainland Southeast Asia, chickens moved across Asia and into the Western world along networks already humming with exchange. Maritime routes used by early Greek, Etruscan, and Phoenician traders helped carry them through the Mediterranean. Overland systems moved them across Inner Asia. Evidence from southern Central Asia now suggests chickens were widely raised there from around the 4th century BCE onward, likely along the Silk Road corridor. At multiple sites, abundant eggshell fragments identified through biomolecular techniques indicate something profound. By that stage, chickens were no longer merely traveling curiosities. They had become embedded in local economies and probably in regular egg production. That may sound like a technical detail. It is not. A bird that lays seasonally is one kind of companion. A bird that can be managed for more sustained egg production is another. That shift changes settlement life. It changes diet. It changes household labor. It changes what can be traded, eaten, stored, expected. A modest bird begins to alter the tempo of daily provisioning. So the chicken's rise was not a single explosion. It was a sequence of thresholds. First attraction to human-made grain landscapes. Then domestication. Then symbolic importance. Then movement through trade. Then economic intensification. Then dietary normalization. Only after passing through all those gates does the bird become what we now take for granted. And even in Europe, that transformation came later than once believed. For years, claims placed chickens in Europe astonishingly early. New radiocarbon work forced a correction. Many supposed early finds turned out to be younger than advertised. The clearest evidence now indicates that chickens did not arrive in Mediterranean Europe until around the first millennium BCE, roughly 800 BCE in some reconstructions, and that their establishment farther north took much longer. In Britain, regular consumption seems not to become common until the Roman period, especially in urban and military contexts. In some regions, centuries pass between a chicken's arrival and its acceptance as ordinary food. That time lag matters because it reminds us that domestication is not the same thing as immediate utility. Animals do not become normal overnight. Societies absorb them through belief, taboo, status, imitation, and practical experiment. The chicken conquered the world slowly enough for culture to leave fingerprints everywhere. And then, at last, those fingerprints became a grip. Empires favored standardizable life. Roads, ships, camps, markets, taxation, provisioning networks, and dense settlement all reward species that reproduce quickly and adapt well to confinement. Chickens fit that world almost perfectly. By the time later states and commercial systems expanded, the bird was ready. What began as a forest edge opportunist had become a companion of granaries, courtyards, ports, caravans, and barracks. Seen from far enough away, this is not just the history of a bird. It is the history of how human beings reshape ecologies, and how those ecologies reshape us in return. Rice agriculture did not merely feed people. It invited another species into history. Trade routes did not merely move goods. They moved living systems. Ritual did not merely decorate subsistence. It helped determine which animals were protected long enough to matter. Empire did not merely conquer land. It standardized appetite. That is why the origin of the chicken was never a trivial question. To ask where the chicken came from is really to ask when human landscapes became so powerful that they could pull wild creatures into new evolutionary futures. It is to ask how a local encounter at the edge of field and forest became a global biological fact. It is to ask how something once vivid, strange, and probably half-wild became so common that billions of bodies now pass through human hands each year with almost no thought at all. And maybe that is the strangest part. The chicken did not enter the world as inevitability. It entered through contingency, a certain bird, in a certain region, meeting a certain agricultural frontier at the right moment. Ancient molecules, corrected dates, and re-examined bones did not just tidy up a historical footnote. They restored proportion. They showed that one of the most abundant animals on Earth began not in a timeless blur, but in a specific human-made environment whose consequences kept widening long after anyone could see the full circle. So the next time a chicken appears in the most ordinary way possible, in a yard, in a market, in the quiet weight of an egg in your hand, it may feel a little less ordinary than before. Inside that familiar presence is the memory of monsoon fields, wary junglefowl at the forest edge, traders carrying living cargo, graves where birds were buried whole, and the immense slow machinery of civilization turning a small animal into a global inheritance. If these long-view stories are the kind you like returning to, you're welcome to stay with us for the next one. Because sometimes the most common things on Earth are the ones that took the longest to truly see.